Welcome to Life Stories. Today, we bring you a heartfelt tale of kindness, unexpected connections, and the power of empathy. Meet Emma, a quiet library assistant who finds comfort in the pages of books. And Jake, a lonely boy in a wheelchair. When their paths cross, it sparks a bond neither of them anticipated. But little do they know, this simple connection will change their lives forever. Join us as we dive into a story of love, vulnerability, and profound life lessons. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. Emma Carter had never expected that her life would revolve around the quiet hum of bookshelves and the rustle of pages. Growing up in foster care, Emma found solace in the written word when the world around her felt chaotic. The characters within those books became her family, her escape, her sanctuary. In a life devoid of stability, these stories provided warmth, the kind she never knew as a child. There was always love in the stories she read. Love that was unconditional, love that saw through the imperfections, love that held people together. But life outside the pages, Emma had learned early on, was not like that. She had come to realize that people rarely saw her for who she truly was, but rather, for what she was, someone struggling, someone barely holding it all together. Working as a part-time library assistant wasn't much, but it was enough to get by. She paid rent, managed to keep food on her table, and did a bit of babysitting on the side for some extra cash. Despite the long hours, Emma never complained. She knew that self-pity had no place in her life. It never helped anyone. Still, there were days when she wished for something more. A family, a sense of belonging. It was a rainy afternoon, much like any other, when Emma first saw him. She was quietly shelving books, the familiar routine helping her push the thoughts of her lonely evenings to the back of her mind. When she noticed him sitting near the window, his small, fragile figure was hunched over, his face partially hidden by the pages of a fairy tale book. He was alone, his wheelchair positioned just out of reach of the lower shelves. Emma didn't know why, but there was something about the way he sat, so still, so silent, that tugged at her heart. He wasn't reading, he was just staring at the book. The way someone does when they've given up trying to make sense of things. And then she saw him try to reach for another book, one just above his grasp. His small hands stretched upward with quiet determination. But the book was too high. He couldn't reach it. Emma's chest tightened as she watched him struggle, his frustration palpable despite the silence. Without thinking, she walked over to him, her voice soft and gentle. "Need some help?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light, not wanting to startle him. The boy looked up, his wide, striking blue eyes meeting hers. For a moment, he just stared at her, as though he was unsure whether she was truly speaking to him or simply passing by. Emma smiled warmly and reached for the book he couldn't quite reach. "Here you go," she said, pulling it from the shelf and placing it carefully in his hands. The boy's gaze shifted down to the book, his fingers tracing the title as if it was something precious to him. The book was The Brave Knight and the Starlit Queen. His voice, when he spoke, was barely a whisper. "I like this one," he murmured. Emma crouched down to his level, meeting his eyes. "It's a great story," she replied. "Have you read it before?" The boy nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a wistful sadness. "A long time ago," he said, his voice quieter now, almost as though speaking to himself. Emma could see how much that book meant to him, like a thread to the past, to a time when things might have been different. "Would you like me to read it to you?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She immediately regretted the offer, unsure if she was overstepping. But the boy didn't seem to mind. Instead, he looked up at her, his eyes wide with surprise. After a long pause, he nodded, without hesitation. Emma pulled out a chair and sat next to him. She opened the book, her voice soft but animated as she began to read. She did different voices for the characters, bringing the story to life. The boy's face lit up, and she saw him relax for the first time since she'd walked over. He was listening intently, hanging on every word, and then, she heard it, the softest, sweetest sound, a small laugh escaped him. something light and free. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh. And it took Emma by surprise. It was a sound that lingered in her heart long after the moment had passed. What Emma didn't realize, though, was that someone else was watching. The library's security cameras had caught everything, the moment she helped the boy. The way she read to him. And most importantly, the way he laughed. A few hours later, in a penthouse office overlooking the city, Alex Johnson, a billionaire media mogul, replayed the footage. At first, he thought nothing of it. Just another kind stranger, offering a moment of charity to his son, Jake, who had always loved books. But there was something different about the way Emma interacted with Jake. It wasn't just politeness, it was engagement. She was truly present, not distracted or distant, and it caught his attention. As he watched the screen, he saw something he hadn't seen in years, his son smiling. Laughing, like he hadn't in so long. It was a sight that made Alex pause. His curiosity piqued in a way it hadn't been in ages. As Alex sat back in his chair, he found himself wondering about the woman in the video. Who was she? What did she want from his son? From him? The next day, Emma returned to the library as she always did. It was a routine that grounded her. A familiar comfort in the midst of her quiet, often lonely life. She made her way to the children's section, feeling the cool air of the library and hearing the familiar sounds of pages turning in quiet footsteps. But as she entered the area, she noticed something that made her stop in her tracks. Jake was sitting in the exact same spot he had been in the day before. His small figure hunched over a book, his wheelchair carefully positioned just beyond the reach of the lower shelves. The sight of him waiting, once again, stirred something deep inside her. A tenderness that she couldn't quite explain. She hadn't expected him to come back. When their eyes met, Emma hesitated. There was a flicker of uncertainty in her chest. She wasn't sure if she should approach him again. Was it too much? Too soon? She had read to him once. But could she really form a bond like that? With someone who seemed so isolated from the world? But before she could overthink it, Jake turned his head and looked at her. His gaze hopeful yet guarded. "Can you read to me again?" he asked. His words simple but filled with a weight that Emma couldn't ignore. She smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "Of course," she replied, sitting down next to him without a second thought. Just like that, a routine began. Every afternoon, Jake would be waiting for her. They would read books together, talk about stories, and share small pieces of their lives. Slowly, Jake began to open up, revealing fragments of his world. He told Emma about the books he used to read with his mother before she passed away. Stories that made his heart swell with bittersweet nostalgia. He told her about the adventures he wished he could have. The knights and heroes who ran across fields and climbed mountains, longing to be one of them. Emma listened without judgment. She never treated him differently. Never spoke to him out of pity or forced kindness. Instead, she saw him for who he was. Not the wheelchair or the scars of loss. She saw a boy with dreams. A boy who just wanted to be a child, full of hope and possibility. And Jake noticed, for the first time in a long time, someone saw him, not as someone to be pitied, not as someone broken, but as someone worthy of being heard. Emma made him feel visible, and that made all the difference. As the days passed, Emma found herself growing more attached to Jake. She had never had a family, never known what it was like to be truly needed by someone. But with Jake, she felt as though she had finally found a place where she belonged. She would bring new books each day, and they would immerse themselves in the stories together, escaping into worlds of dragons, treasure hunts, and knights on noble quests. In Jake's laughter, Emma found something she hadn't realized she had been missing for so long: joy. But her presence in Jake's life did not go unnoticed. One evening, as she was packing up to leave, Alex Johnson, Jake's father, arrived at the library. He wasn't someone who usually paid much attention to the people around him. His life was consumed by his company, his meetings, and the ever-expanding media empire he had built from the ground up. After his wife's death, he had buried himself in his work, hoping that the constant hustle would keep the loneliness at bay. But now, every evening, he found himself watching the security footage of the library. Watching the way Emma smiled at Jake. The way she read to him. The way she treated him like he was just another child. It was a different kind of attention. One that piqued Alex's curiosity. His son hadn't laughed like that in years. He hadn't smiled so freely. So genuinely. In such a long time. It was something Alex couldn't ignore. Something that made him wonder about the woman who had sparked that change. Who was she? And what did she want? The next day, Emma was restocking books when she felt a presence behind her. She turned around and came face to face with a tall, sharply dressed man. His eyes were intense, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, she felt a chill run through her. She recognized him immediately. It was Alex Johnson, the billionaire businessman, and the father of the boy she had been reading to. "You're the one who's been reading to my son," Alex said, his voice cool and controlled. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She had been caught off guard by the sudden appearance of someone so important. Someone so far removed from her quiet, simple world. Her throat went dry, and she swallowed hard. I just help him with books," Emma stammered, unsure of how to respond. Alex's gaze never wavered. "Why?" he asked, his question sharp and direct. Emma blinked, taken aback. She hadn't expected that. Why? It wasn't a question she had ever really thought about. I don't want anything from him," she said quietly, finding her voice. "I just like reading to him. He's a great kid." There was a long pause. A silence that seemed to hang between them, heavy with something unspoken. Then, to Emma's surprise, Alex's face softened. Just for a moment, he studied her for another beat, as if trying to figure out who she really was. And then, as quickly as it came, the softness vanished, replaced by the same cool, composed expression he had worn when he first approached her. "Interesting," Alex murmured, and with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Emma standing there, feeling more uncertain than ever about the direction her life seemed to be taking. What she didn't realize was that her life was about to change in ways she could never have predicted. The days after her brief encounter with Alex Johnson felt strange to Emma. The library had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in books and the quiet rhythm of her routine. But now, it felt different. She couldn't help but replay her conversation with Alex in her mind, trying to understand what had just happened. It was hard to shake the feeling that she had somehow crossed a line. Or worse, that she was being scrutinized. Despite her unease, Emma continued to meet Jake every afternoon. She would arrive, and there he would be, waiting for her in the same spot. They continued reading together, sharing stories, and Jake slowly opened up more. He spoke of his mother, of their trips to the park and the adventures they used to have before her illness took her away. He told Emma about his dreams, about how he longed to be strong, to run, to fight dragons like the heroes in his books. Emma listened, never with pity, never with an agenda. She was simply there, present, kind, understanding. She made him feel like any other child, not someone to be watched with cautious eyes or whispered about behind his back. Jake's affection for her grew with each passing day. He waited for her eagerly, his face lighting up when she arrived, as if she were the highlight of his day. And in many ways, she was. In a world that often overlooked him, Emma saw him for who he was. And that made all the difference. But that change hadn't gone unnoticed. Alex began to watch them more intently. At first, it was just curiosity. He was intrigued by the way Emma seemed so effortlessly connected to his son. So comfortable in the space he himself had never been able to occupy. As a father, he had always tried to provide Jake with everything he could. He'd showered him with expensive gifts, enrolled him in the best schools, and surrounded him with people who could help fill the void left by his late wife. But nothing seemed to make Jake smile like Emma's simple presence did. Alex knew he had to know more. He couldn't ignore the bond forming between them, and he couldn't help but feel a strange tug in his chest whenever he saw them together. He began to wonder if this woman was somehow what his son needed. Something more than the material things he had always thought could fix everything. One evening, Alex's assistant called. "Sir," the assistant said hesitantly, "we've reviewed the footage from the library. There's something different about the woman who's been reading to Jake. She's not just being polite. She's engaged, truly present. And Jake, well, he's smiling more. He hasn't done that in years." Alex's mind raced. The woman had been having an effect on his son. And he didn't fully understand why. He had grown accustomed to people wanting things from him: money, status, connections. But Emma wasn't asking for anything. She was simply giving. A few days later, Alex arrived at the library again. But this time, he wasn't there just to watch. He needed to speak with Emma. He needed answers. He needed to know who she was and what her intentions were. When Emma turned and saw him standing there, a familiar unease bubbled up in her chest. She'd expected to see him again. But she wasn't sure how to handle it. Alex's presence felt imposing, and it made her realize just how out of place she felt in his world. "You've been spending a lot of time with my son," Alex said, his tone cool but not unfriendly. Emma swallowed hard. She'd never imagined that her simple kindness could be the subject of someone like Alex's attention. "I just enjoy reading to him," Emma said quietly, her voice betraying none of the nerves she felt. "Jake's a wonderful kid. I just want to help him feel like a normal child. Not someone people avoid or pity." Alex studied her carefully, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Emma thought he might say something dismissive. Or worse, ask her to stay away from Jake. But instead, he simply nodded, almost thoughtfully. "Interesting," he said again, and without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Emma to grapple with the confusion and uncertainty that his presence had stirred. She hadn't known it then, but this encounter would be the beginning of a new chapter in both their lives. One that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves. About love, and about what truly matters. As Emma stood there, watching Alex walk away, she couldn't help but wonder about the strange turn her life had taken. What had started as a simple act of kindness had begun to unravel into something far more complicated. She wasn't looking for anything from Alex or his son. She had never expected her world to collide with theirs in such an intimate way. But as the days passed, it became clear that the bond she had with Jake, the quiet moments they shared, had started to mean something more, not just to her, but to Alex as well. The weight of her decision to stay in Jake's life became harder to ignore. Every time she saw the joy on his face, every time he laughed or shared his dreams with her, she knew she couldn't walk away. She had finally found a place where she belonged, even if it meant stepping into a world she never thought she'd be part of. One evening, after a particularly quiet day at the library, Emma received an unexpected invitation. It was from Alex, a letter sealed with an elegant emblem, inviting her to meet him at his home. The thought of entering his lavish world, of stepping into the mansion that belonged to one of the wealthiest men in the city, made her feel both out of place and strangely intrigued. Little did she know, her decision to go would change everything. For Alex, for Jake, and for herself. Sometimes, the stories we find ourselves in are not the ones we expect. But they're the ones that shape us in ways we never imagined. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more heartfelt tales like this. Stay tuned for new stories coming soon.